In the outer arc of the Varellan Rim, past the burned-out moons of Teth 4 and beyond the perimeter sensors of lawful space, a lone human ship drifted through the veil of ancient dust. It wasn't large. Scarred metal hull, mismatched parts, and an overclocked core. Standard specs for smugglers, scavengers, and the desperate. But this wasn't a smuggler's run. Inside that vessel, in a sealed cryochamber barely holding atmosphere, lay a briefcase the size of a shoebox, tucked in foam, suspended in magnetic fields, and flashing with slow, deliberate pulses of blue light. A bio-lock prevented anyone from opening it except its current bearer, and that bearer was now entering orbit above a restricted zone on an alien world that outlawed even the concept of unregistered visitors. The human's name was Kieran Holt, former off-world medic turned exiled biotechnician, once decorated by the Terran Commonwealth for his work in battlefield nano repair systems, now disgraced for defying ethics protocols during an unauthorized rescue mission. Disgrace, however, was a matter of paperwork. In reality, Kieran had saved over 60 lives on that ruined station, patching lungs, reversing necrosis, and halting trauma cycles that official medtechs would have left untreated for lack of clearance. Some called it heroism, the council called it defiance. But out here, far from Earth's clean halls and rulebooks, it had earned him a reputation, especially among species that didn't have the luxury of choosing between survival and sovereignty. Kieran's ship slipped past planetary surveillance with stolen codes, entering through a narrow polar corridor where the magnetic storms gave just enough interference to cloak the final descent. The landing was silent, no lights, no beacon, just dust against steel and the shriek of air-cooling hot ion thrusters. The air outside was thin, dry, but breathable with a modulator. He stepped out, coat flaring against the desert wind, and walked across black sand toward a crumbling communications tower, long since abandoned by the Solarian military, now used only by those who traded in secrets. Waiting there, under the tower's fractured ribs of steel, stood an alien draped in the robes of a Solarian strategos, high-ranking military elite. His skin was pale, shimmering faintly in the dim light, the kind of pale that came from staying indoors too long, or waiting by a hospital bed too often. His name was Rel Jaren, once commander of the Solarian orbital fleet, decorated a dozen times for repelling pirate sieges and holding the fringe sectors during the collapse of the Dreth Confederation. But tonight, Jaren wasn't a commander. He was a father, and the sickness that crept through his child's blood was one no healer in the Empire had been able to stop. They didn't speak for the first few seconds. Just stared. Human and alien, predator and strategist, both uncertain whether the other could be trusted. Then Kieran unlatched the case. Inside was a cylindrical vial, glowing softly. Its contents weren't radioactive, but anyone unfamiliar with quantum-spliced gene chains would have assumed they were. The liquid shimmered in a color that didn't exist in any human spectrum. Heart silver, heart blue, heart something else entirely. Like the memory of a sound trapped in glass. Jaren stepped forward, eyes wide, his mandibles twitching in restrained hope. "This is the last one," Kieran said, his voice low, serious. "The Commonwealth seized the lab after I was discharged. I got this out during lockdown. It's unstable. You'll need to synthesize it fast, or it burns out." Jaren didn't ask about price. Didn't ask if it worked. His daughter was dying, and this was the only thing any species had found that slowed Solarian neurodecay syndrome. It didn't matter if the cure came from humans, or that possession of Terran biogenetics was punishable by death under Solarian law. His family line was on the verge of ending. His child, barely 14 cycles old, had begun to seize during sleep. She no longer recognized her caretakers. She screamed when the sun rose. Her neural scaffolding was collapsing, and even the Empire's most advanced neuromaps couldn't halt the spread. This vial was salvation, and treason in equal measure. He took it with shaking hands, tucked it inside a sealed pouch lined with inert shielding, and then, quietly, reached into his robes. What he pulled out wasn't a credit chip, wasn't a weapon or security token. It was a silver disc, etched with fractal patterns too complex to be artificial. Kieran narrowed his eyes as it activated, projecting two separate data feeds in the air between them. The first was a security breach schematic, brief, time-stamped, and marked with clearance levels so high even Solarian intelligence couldn't track who had access. It showed a planetary defense rotation. Every 6 hours, the orbital shields around Sector V4, home to government complexes, military headquarters, and treasury archives, had a rotation misalignment of exactly 9.2 seconds. Just long enough for one object of shuttle size or smaller to slip through, undetectable, unchallenged, fatal if used correctly. The second was older, brainier, a legal document, Treaty 491C, dated 322 years prior, between the Solarian Empire and all species designated non-aligned observers. Humans, at the time, hadn't even achieved lunar colonies, but the clause stated clearly that no non-aligned, unarmed sentient could be executed or imprisoned by the Empire without trial by interstellar forum, except in cases of direct military aggression. This still holds, Kieran asked, frowning. The High Command buried it, Jaren replied, but it was never rescinded. If they take you in, and you survive long enough to speak of it, you might walk free. Or trigger war. Kieran nodded slowly, brain already filing through scenarios, leverage points, and risk factors. This wasn't just about curing a child anymore. This was about empire, exploitable weaknesses, forgotten laws, entire sectors that could collapse if this information reached the wrong ears. Jaren turned to leave, but froze as his comm implant flared. His eyes widened. They found us. It happened fast. No warning. No sirens. A single blue beam lanced down from orbit. Jaren didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply vanished, converted to atoms in a flash of Empire-grade laser precision. Execution without trial, without witness, without honor. Kieran staggered back, the disc still clutched in his palm. Dust swirled, the ground hummed, and in the next breath, armored figures emerged from the storm. Silent, towering, weapons drawn. Solarian enforcers, elite, unforgiving. The enforcers moved like shadows with weight, each step precise, each gesture calculated for intimidation. Their armor wasn't decorative. It was military-issue obsidian-plated exosuits, with integrated neural compliance injectors and anti-telepathic shielding. Kieran barely had time to raise his hands before a kinetic pulse struck his chest and flung him into the side of his ship. Stars exploded in his vision as the world tilted, and his legs crumpled under him. The disc slipped from his hand and embedded itself halfway into the sand. One of the enforcers stepped forward and seized it, scanning it with a light burst. Another drove a sharp magnetic shackle into Kieran's wrist, locking him to a control collar that hummed against the base of his skull. Compliance circuitry wrapped around his nerves, bypassing the pain centers just enough to ensure he could walk. Barely, but couldn't run, couldn't resist, couldn't speak unless permitted. They didn't kill him. That surprised him. Instead, they dragged him across the black sand, forced him into a containment pod that hissed shut around his body, and launched him skyward without a single word. As the planet fell away, Kieran's breath grew shallow. Not because of the altitude, but because of the thought echoing in his mind. Jaren had been executed instantly. Not arrested, not tried. That was a breach of Imperial law. But no one seemed to care. The moment Jaren exchanged data with a human, his loyalty was declared broken. No explanation, no context, no defense, just erasure. The pod jolted as it docked with a carrier ship in low orbit. Inside, everything was sterile white, Imperial military precision. No ornamentation, no symbolism. Just steel, light, and silence. A synthetic voice listed off charges in a tongue Kieran didn't understand. Then, without transition, a universal translator embedded in his collar kicked in. Article 17 Delta, Acquisition of Sovereign Military Intelligence. Article 31F, Unauthorized Presence on Sovereign Ground. Article 42B, Biotechnical Contamination of Imperial Lineage, punishable by sector law execution or cerebral disassembly. He blinked. Cerebral disassembly. Context. Separation of higher neural cognition from core memory for archival review prior to disposal. Right, they were threatening to erase his brain, store his thoughts, and then burn the rest. Kieran was chained in a suspension rig and flown, still in the pod, through 2 jump gates and into the heart of Solarian space. It was not a quiet journey. Alarms pulsed every time they crossed into another restricted zone. Guards in gunmetal bray rotated in shifts, each more silent than the last. But none of them spoke to him. None acknowledged him as sentient. To them, he was not a prisoner. He was evidence, an anomaly, something to be logged, studied, discarded. He tried to speak once, just once, and the collar shocked him so hard his vision went white. They arrived at the Varn Axis, the judicial citadel of the Solarian Empire. A structure the size of a city, orbiting a red giant star, carved from layered crystal and dark steel, suspended in geostationary lock among a ring of drifting vertic platforms. From orbit, the axis looked like a spider clinging to a web spun from sunlight and shadows. It was beautiful, and it was a place from which few ever returned. The pod docked on sub-level 7. Kieran was escorted through a corridor so wide it felt built for giants. The walls pulsed with old runes and legal codexes, some glowing, others flickering as if in protest. 1,000 languages echoed faintly through the infrastructure, recordings of past verdicts, screams, confessions, and rituals of final rites, playing on loop. At the end of the corridor, 2 doors opened in opposite directions. One led to an interrogation chamber, the other to a medical bay. They chose the medical bay first. A cluster of biotechnicians descended on Kieran like scavengers on a corpse. They took blood, tissue, neural samples. They ran subdermal scans, interrogated his genetic markers, evaluated his reflexes and emotional reactions using synthetic dream triggers. He didn't scream, didn't resist. He just stared at the ceiling while a machine tried to interpret the structure of his soul through electrical feedback patterns. After 6 hours, they had enough. They concluded. Subject has undergone cortical stress exceeding 9.4 on the trauma scale. Recommendation: retain lucid for formal proceedings. Physical termination may compromise trial clarity. It wasn't mercy, it was procedural. From there, they dumped him in a holding cell. No bed, no light, just a sliver of nutrient mist that sprayed from the ceiling every few hours to keep him hydrated. Time blurred. He slept only when his body gave out. He dreamt of Sharon, of the flash of light, of the child whose fate now hung in the balance of a political system that measured justice in decimal points and bloodlines. Finally, after what must have been 2 days, or maybe more, a voice pierced the cell. Subject 411, transfer to Tribunal Chamber 3A. They brought him up through the inner spire of the axis. The chamber at the top was cavernous, carved from obsidian crystal and laced with memory veins, raw neural data etched into the walls, pulsing with the knowledge of every case tried in the Empire's history. A dais rose in the center like a mountain, and upon it sat the tri-judge, 3 beings, each representing a branch of imperial authority, military, civilian, and genetic purity. The military judge was encased in armor that pulsed with old battle scars, more machine than flesh. The civilian was almost invisible, a formless presence projected through light and law. But the genetic purity judge, she was cold, still, beautiful in a way that made the air freeze. Her eyes were lenses that saw beyond molecules. And her voice, when it came, echoed without vibration. This being stands accused of facilitating a sovereign betrayal through the transfer of forbidden biogenetics in exchange for imperial defense protocols and classified legal artifacts. The accused is not a citizen. The accused is not protected by interstellar representation. The accused is human. Kieran didn't speak. He knew enough to let them finish. Interrupting was punishable by instant nerve lockdown. The chamber adjusted, dimming. A holographic replay began to form. Audio and visuals reconstructed from satellite captures and recovered atmospheric imprints. They showed him handing over the vial, Jaren accepting it, the disc, the data, the moment of death. A murmur ran through the walls, like an old cathedral coughing memories. The civilian judge spoke next. The accused was in possession of data linked to Treaty 491C. Archived, obsolete, never ratified by updated council. Usage as defense is invalid pending formal review. Kieran finally spoke, his voice cracked but held. Then review it, review all of it, because if I die, you erase not just me, but the child I saved. The proof of what Jaren did, the legacy of someone who died trying to save life, not destroy it. The military judge growled, you presume your intervention was life. But what if your cure creates aberration? What if your nanotech rewrote a Solarian heir's genome? What if, in trying to save her, you erased her? Kieran stepped forward, despite the collar, despite the risk. Then let her testify. Silence. Every being in the chamber froze. The genetic purity judge leaned forward for the first time. What did you say? She's alive, Kieran said. That's what you're really afraid of, isn't it? That Jaren succeeded, that my cure worked, that your laws are so afraid of impurity, you'd rather erase the evidence than face the truth. The room darkened. Above him, a singular voice, mechanical, ancient, without origin, filled the air. This tribunal suspends judgment. A ruling will be issued upon verification of subject Alpha Jaren, Child 47's condition. Until then, the human will remain in custody. Kieran was pulled backward by the collar, arms bound, heart pounding. As the doors sealed, he turned his head one last time and said, "If she's alive, then so is your conscience." The doors slammed shut. Blackness. Jalen stood frozen in the shadows of the courtyard as the crowd chanted. He had seen many strange things across star systems. Ion storms devour frigates whole, gravity wells tear metal apart, even a man slit his own throat to keep a secret, but he had never seen a death broadcast like this. The plaza lights dimmed. Then, with a theatrical brevity befitting ancient rituals, the court's spire opened. The execution weapon revealed itself, a silvery floating sphere no larger than a melon, hovering silently above the accused. No cables, no glow, just silent death, primed and humming with quantum instability. Across the court, Ambassador Bailey stood shackled but tall, refusing to kneel. The child was not present, nor was the council willing to delay, despite the ambassador's final request for a moment with his offspring. "Let them live," he'd said. "Just let them live." The moment stretched, as if the galaxy held its breath. Then the sphere blinked red, and in a fraction of a second, Bailey was vaporized. No scream, no body, just a swirl of charged ash and a faint echo, like a sigh through broken glass. The crowd erupted, not in rage or grief, but in a silence so complete it felt like the end of sound. This wasn't justice, it was cleansing, it was a warning. The spire sealed itself, as if nothing had happened. The guards turned to the human. Jalen's mind raced. He reached instinctively for the pocket that once held the nanomedicine vial, but it was gone, surrendered days ago. His only weapon now was what Bailey had given him, 2 secrets that could destabilize an empire, and a child still clinging to life in an undisclosed location. The guards approached, no words, just an electronic leash around his throat and a jolt that locked his knees. His body dropped, convulsing in the dirt as his vision swam. Then blackness swallowed him. He woke in a transport cell, colder than vacuum. Steel walls hummed with kinetic dampeners. The only sound was the slow, calculated breathing of someone else in the darkness. "Human," came a voice, soft, old, brittle with contempt. "You are accused of planetary treason, interspecies bribery, and unauthorized use of restricted genetic technology. You will answer before the tribunal." Jalen coughed, then laughed. "You forgot illegal parking." A silence followed, then another jolt of pain that seared his ribs. "You mock justice." "No," Jalen replied through gritted teeth. "I mock bureaucracy that murders its own to hide a cracked facade." They dragged him through a gauntlet of stairs, cameras, officials. Alien species of every shape and posture lined the observation decks, whispering in 50 dialects. A human in chains wasn't just a trial, it was theater. Proof that order still held. He passed through scanners that probed his brain for anomalies, past translators that cataloged every micro-expression. He gave them nothing, not until he saw the chamber doors. Not until he knew this wasn't a holding game, it was the real stage. The court of equilibrium was not built for spectacle, but for fear. A ring of hovering judge thrones, each occupied by towering figures in obsidian robes that pulsed with bioluminescent authority. No jury, no advocates, just evidence, confession, and judgment. In the center, a platform floated above an energy well so dense it bent the air. They strapped Jalen to its center. He could see no sky, no allies, only the void above and the quiet beneath. Then the voice returned, magnified, filtered through 5 alien vocal processors. Human entity Jalen Voss. "Do you understand the charges levied against you?" He nodded once. "I do. Do you contest them?" Silence. Then he raised his head. "Yes, every one of them." The judges leaned forward. One clicked a mandible, another folded its neck twice, like, nodding. "You deny offering bribes. I gave a father a chance to save his dying child. You call that bribery. You deny receiving state secrets from a foreign diplomat. He gave me the truth. If that's a crime, you've built your empire on lies." Murmurs swelled in the chamber. One of the judges hissed for silence. Another floated down slightly, lowering its throne closer to Jalen's eye level. "Do you deny knowledge of the illegal nanomedicine in your possession?" Jalen didn't flinch. "No, I knew what it was. And I'd do it again." The chamber dimmed. Somewhere behind the judges, A holographic display flickered to life, showing footage recovered from a surveillance drone, Jalen handing over the vial. Vaguely clutching it with shaking hands, the child's stasis pod flickering nearby. The hush in the courtroom turned electric. There it was. Proof, not just of a transaction, but of motive, emotion, desperation. The audience stared. For many, it was their first glimpse of human compassion, or manipulation, depending on what lens you wore. Jalen turned toward the judges. You want a confession? Fine, I gave him that vial knowing it was illegal, knowing your laws, but I also know this. Your people begged Earth for genetic help 10 years ago during the Varax plague. You refused because you didn't want to seem weak. So millions died. Your rules don't protect life. They protect pride. I broke them to save one. The silence was volcanic. Even the guards shifted uneasily. Somewhere in the gallery, a journalist blinked a message to their editor. Human on trial. Confessed. Claimed moral superiority. Huge story. Then came the final act of part 1. The moment that would haunt Jalen for the rest of his days. A small, spherical pod was wheeled into the chamber. Frosted, humming softly, a biosignature pulsed on its outer ring. The child, still alive, he hadn't known. Somehow, Vailey's last request had been honored. Jalen's knees buckled, the guard steadied him, but he barely noticed. The pod turned to face the tribunal, and from within the glass, 2 small eyes opened, wide, confused, terrified. One judge raised a hand. You speak of mercy, of ethics. Then answer this. Human, was saving the child worth the cost? Jalen stared at the child, then at the ashes of Vailey displayed holographically beside him. He closed his eyes. Ask me again after you pass judgment. Because if you say no, if you tell me mercy isn't worth a life, then your empire's already dead. The chamber lights flickered. The tribunal's robes dimmed. One by one, the judges turned inward, beginning private deliberation. No gavel, no countdown, just the quiet hum of power aligning itself into decision. The guards seized Jalen again, dragging him backward through the chamber. The courtroom was unlike anything a human mind could have imagined. Shaped like an amphitheater carved into obsidian, every tiered level buzzed with alien judges, observers, and enforcers. Holograms spun silently above the platform, genetic schematics, treaty clauses, surveillance footage. And at the very center, on a small metal disc just large enough for his boots, stood the man they called the instigator. The outsider, the human. Jalen Voss didn't flinch under the countless eyes. He didn't look for mercy. He simply stood upright, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. Not from fear, but from the need to not lash out. The walls around him hummed, holding him in place with quantum stasis fields. A single twitch in the wrong direction and his atoms would be pulled apart before the thought could finish forming. And yet, none of that was what terrified him. It was the silence. Then the voice came. The High Tribunal of the Thulkar Conclave now convenes under Galactic Precedence Article 928X to determine the guilt of Homo sapiens designation. Jalen Voss echoed the deep, multi-layered voice of the presiding arbiter. Charged with bribery, espionage, technological interference, and indirect treason via influence over a conclave official. A ripple moved through the crowd. Holograms lit up. Jalen's voice was played back, his recorded meeting with Commander Velrek. The moment the vial changed hands, the details of the secret orbital defense grid, the decrypted clause from the ancient pact, piece by piece, his act of mercy was painted as a calculated infiltration. But Jalen didn't move. He didn't defend himself, not because he was guilty, but because no one in that room had cared to ask why. In the back of the chamber, a sound stirred, a faint hiss. Then a pod glided forward, hovering gently on repulsion fields. It stopped before the tribunal. The shell peeled open, and a soft blue glow poured out. Inside, the child, Velric's daughter, breathing. She blinked slowly, confused by the lights, the crowd, the whispers. Her skin had color again. Her heartbeat was strong. The nanon had worked. She was alive, not a concept on a chart, not a symbol of rebellion. Just a child. A murmur passed through the room. One of the arbiters leaned forward. Let the record reflect. The child is no longer terminal. Another answered, that changes nothing. The human acquired military-grade biogenics through illegal channels and compromised Conclave security in exchange for alien secrets. Then, for the first time since his arrest, Jalen spoke. "No, I didn't compromise your security. You compromised your own soul when you let a child die because your rules said you had to." Gasps rang out, but Jalen kept going. "You punish a man for saving a life. Not for profit, not for weapons, not to shift power, but because the system you build values silence over compassion." A pause followed. Even the arbiter waited. Then, coolly, he said, "The tribunal acknowledges the statement. The accused will now be held while deliberations begin." Suddenly, the floor beneath Jalen shimmered. A transport field activated. His body was deconstructed and blinked out of the chamber, imprisoned elsewhere. The child was wheeled away in silence. The room emptied with tension still hanging like smoke in the air. And far above the Conclave city, on a station that orbited the great red moon of Varellan, a signal was sent. Earth has interfered. Another faction had taken notice. The galaxy was about to react. But for now, only one truth remained. He gave an alien the cure, and now the galaxy wanted him dead.